to the launch of the Mass Poor People's Low-Wage Assembly and Moral March on Washington, D.C., June 18, 2022.
We are a new, unsettling force, and we are powerful. New, unsettling force, and we are here.
We're rising up to demonstrate the compelling power that we, poor and low-income people, have to reconstruct society from the bottom up.
And we need to do it with the loudest voices possible, the biggest actions possible.
Because we know that there is no scarcity in this land. The only scarcity is the moral will to do what's right.
Hold on, just a little while longer.
We are those with sub-minimum wage jobs who can't afford sky-high rent.
People with disabilities are the fastest growing minority group.
It's crazy to me that in 2021, it's still legal for workplaces to pay a sub-minimum wage to people with disabilities.
There are still so much trial and tribulations that we go through as Indigenous people. We can't get a decent wage to sustain ourselves, nor can we get adequate housing.
Veterans across this nation say enough is enough. We can't pat essential workers on the back on one day and then cut their health care the next day.
Health is a political choice.
What more do I need to do to prove that my voice is just as valuable as anyone else's?
There are still forces in denial that would try to slow walk our transition to a clean economy and a just future for us all.
We have an immoral system run by immoral people.
But together we walk, and we walk and we fight.
It's time for a change. Reconstruyamos esta gran nación.
See, we are people of resilience as we fight these interlocking injustices together.
When we work together, mobilize together, and rise together, we become a voice for the voiceless, and we become an agent of change in a time where great change is needed.
We need the third reconstruction to ensure that deaf people, people with disabilities, and all people can have the right to live and to thrive.
We know what they are doing, but the question is, what are we going to do? Reconstruction begins when we change our mentality and say it's time for you to get your foot off of my neck.
Justice is coming soon.
Hey! Do you believe that today?
Let me first of all thank Dr. D. Jordan for her gracious introduction and for all that she does. And for when we were taping this, reminding us of the ancestors. She spoke of her grandmother. I thought of my grandmother, all of those who come before us, the great heroes and sheroes who did so much on the behalf of justice. I often say that we have to make sure that we don't do less with more, because they surely did more with less when it came to fighting for justice. Tonight, at this American Geographical Society's annual fall symposium today, as all of you have gathered here around this theme toward a more equitable future, I'm just honored, first of all, to be here on behalf of Repairers of the Breach and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, where I co-chair with my sister, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, and that represents now 43 state coordinating committees, more than 2,500 clergy of all different religions and theological perspectives, more than 200 partners in this nation. A movement that grows out of our deepest moral and religious traditions, where we believe that we must have moral analysis of our problems, that the puny terms of left versus right and moderate are too puny to really address what's going on in society. We have to have a moral agenda We must have a moral articulation of that agenda that puts the faces and the stories of the people who are being hurt the most at the bottom forward first. And then we have to have moral action where at times we must put our very bodies on the line nonviolently in order to shift the moral narrative in this nation. I'm honored to be here with you. And tonight I want to talk about why we must have a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington to declare new possibilities in America. And while we're moving towards that and mobilizing, we ask all of you to join in meeting us on June 18th, 2022 in Washington, D.C., not for a day or a anniversary remembrance of days in the past, but as a declaration that declares some of the realities that we see now do not have to exist, must change, and they must change on our watch. In the Poor People's Campaign, we believe that there are these interlocking injustices: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the underfunding of our children's future and public education, the denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. As I have traveled with many others the length and the breadth of this country, as I stand here today, I'm just coming back from the courtroom where Ahmaud Avery's family is now, the young 25-year-old electrician that was shot down in the street just for jogging while Black through a community that 3 armed white men said he ought not be, and he was a threat. And I'm literally just coming to this speech after just hearing that Dante Sharp, a 19-year-old man, grew up poor and low wealth. He was 19, when he was falsely accused of murder. The system, officers of the law, false witnesses, put him in jail for life. And for more than 28 years, he's been fighting for his freedom. And just a minute or so ago, we got word that Dante is now free and pardoned fully. As I've traveled this nation and gone in the homes, the hollers, the hoods of representatives of the 140 million poor and low wealth members of our community, our American family, 140 million poor and low wealth people before COVID, 8 million more since COVID, but 140 million poor and low wealth people before COVID. 43% of our nation, 52% of our children, 30% of white Americans, 66 million people, 60.9% of Black Americans, 26 million people, 68% of Latinos and natives. And yet, in this nation, so often, they are rendered invisible in every community. We have presidential campaigns and elections year after year after year. And think about it, you've not heard one presidential debate in the last 40 years where the full discussion and debate was, if you lead this country, how are you going to address the reality of poverty that impacts nearly 50% of all Americans? It is clear to us that geography and social construction of our shared spaces has everything to do with whether we will become the multi-ethnic democracy that we've never yet been, or whether we're going to continue to descend into the plutocracy and maybe eventually an autocracy that treats corporations like people and people like things. Because the truth of the matter is, whether you're in the geographical space of Appalachia that I've traveled in, or in the deep geographical area of the Deep South, or upstate New York, or the farmlands of Kansas, or the fields and the vineyards of California, or the borders of Texas, or the steelways of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio, poverty and low wealth is a moral problem of our time. And I would like to submit to you today, as you are thinking, that we face a crisis of possibility, a crisis of civilization in America today. One way we see it is whenever we come to policies, we hear a lot of talk about top lines in legislative packages, whether or not it's going to be $3 trillion, $1 trillion, or we hear whether or not we're going to means test people if we pay them a living wage or provide them housing, something, by the way, we never say to corporations. But the truth of the matter is 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country is an absolute shame and a sinful form of public reality in the richest nation in the history of the world, when it is absolutely possible. And we could do it without hardly any effort to provide for everybody's needs. And we know it's done in other countries, Norway, for instance, one of them. I was just talking to Jeffrey Sachs, and he talks about how when he travels to Europe and other places, they wonder, how is it that America hasn't done or won't do what many European countries did 10 or 15 years ago? Too often, we are actually caught up in a false commentary about the probability of a policy passing and whether it's too liberal or too conservative or too moderate. We raise this strange question in a nation that has spent $21 trillion on war and the militarization of our borders since 9/11. And yet we raise this strange question, how much will it cost? Rather than how much does it cost us in the lives of people not to do? We give tax break after tax breaks to the billionaires. We allow the billionaires to spend $14 billion, for instance, in the last presidential election. We give tax breaks over and over again and then say there's no money, when in fact we have allowed people to make money on the backs of others without having to pay their fair share. America's poor and low-wealth people and many moral leaders with the conscience and advocates know that we face a crisis of possibility. Poor people around the world know it. 1% of this world owns more money than 50% of the world, has more money and resources than they could ever spend. In this country right now, we have 400 families that make an average of $97,000 an hour. And yet we have not raised the minimum wage for poor and low-wage workers for 12 years. $7.25 for workers, and for restaurant workers and food services workers, $2.13 an hour plus tips. I was in the Vatican not long ago, and Pope Francis invited me to be a part of a special review of his writings on poverty. And he said, today we see the world has never been so rich. And yet, despite such abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow. And in these times of opulence, when it should be possible to put an end to poverty, the powers of one-track thinking say nothing of the poor, the elderly, the migrants, the unborn, and the seriously ill, mostly invisible. Poor and low-wealth people are treated as disposable, and we find ourselves either talking about the false magic of trickle-down economics, give the wealth all they need, a little bit of trickle-down, or neoliberalism, fix it from the middle up. And we too often don't have the conversation about equitableness, about things being equitable, and meaning that we have to start from the bottom up. This COVID-19 pandemic, though, has forced us to have to deal with it. It's put a spotlight on the fissures of racism and poverty, a spotlight on this nation's poor and low-wage workers. It has laid bare our crisis of possibility. The very people that this nation has too long neglected, all of a sudden when COVID hit, we call them essential. Low-wage workers, they went from being service workers to essential because we wanted to stay home and protect ourselves from a deadly virus. So we said the poor and low-wage workers were essential. Food service workers were essential. Those that take care of our bodies medically were essential. Those that wash our backsides sometimes and can't even go into very hospitals or medical facilities they work for, essential. Those that cut meat, essential. And those essential for those poor and low wealth people, the stats we often don't talk about is during all of this COVID death, the large number were poor and low wealth, low wage people who were the first to have to go to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, and the first to die. We call them essential workers, but we treat them like they're expendable. Even after COVID has made over 50 million sick, and millions upon millions upon millions lost their jobs, some 80 million, and over 700,000 died. We still have not said, you know, these essential workers need living wages, need health care. 8 million more people fell into poverty during COVID, but during the first 19 months of COVID, billionaires made more than $2 trillion. The first COVID relief bill, 84% of it went to the billionaires, the billionaires. And so the truth is, we had a crisis before COVID. COVID has exposed the crisis because even before COVID, of that 140 million people, 700 people were dying a day from poverty. That's 250,000 people a year from poverty, according to the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. And so number one, we must put a face on this crisis of possibility. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is doing. We're bringing together people of every color, every creed, every sexuality, immigration status to build a movement led by those who have experienced political, geographical rejection. In our effort to build this moral fusion coalition, we have emphasized geographical diversity. Before we launched this campaign in 2018, we conducted an audit of America that revealed 140 million poor and low wealth people, the 43% of this nation. And then we disaggregated it by race and by geography. We found that 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, 1/3 of all poor white people live in the South. We disaggregated it because we had been told that there were 39 million poor people. But when we looked at the numbers with some of the best economists and looked at poverty through the lens of the supplemental income, we found this number and concluded there's a crime in a rich nation for people to receive starvation wages. That's what Dr. King said. God never intended for one group of people to live superfluously and in inordinate wealth while others live in abject and deadening poverty. Poverty, we say in this campaign, is not a God-ordained thing. It's made policy. It's not the immorality of the poor, but the immorality of our systems. Our systems are not equitable. It is a result of policy and the interlocking injustices that we named earlier. And when we see how Democrats and Republicans have refused to raise the minimum wage, for instance, it points out an ugly form of classism, elitism, and racism that is in our system, because Racism is not just when you call somebody an N-word. Racism is when you pass policies or block policies that have a disparate impact on people of color. Classism is when you pass policies or block policies that have a disparate impact on poor people. And our Constitution says we are to establish not benevolence, but justice. We are to provide for the common welfare, yes, welfare of all people. And so it is the betrayal of even our Constitution's basic promise when we allow poverty and these interlocking injustices to exist, when in fact we have no scarcity of resources, no scarcity of ideas, but a scarcity of conscience. Otto Schwammer, one of the great thinkers at MIT, says that the problem in our economic system is the problem of conscience, the failure to recognize that we're all interconnected. And it is this lack of conscience that is literally undermining our financial existence and the health of this democracy, because you cannot have 43% of a nation, the richest nation in the world, living in poverty and low wealth, 52% of its children, and that continue, and you're headed toward 50% of the population living in poverty and low wealth, while 3 Americas own more than the bottom almost 60, 70% of the country. You cannot continue to ensure domestic tranquility with that kind of inequality. In fact, let me break it down. Again, 140 million poor and low wealth Americans. That's 52% of our children, 42% of our elders, 33% of white people, 60% of Black people. And poverty impacts more white people, white women with children actually, than any other racial group. But then proportionately, it hurts more Black, Latino, and Asian people. This is where we are. This is where we are. 37 million people, 87 million people in this country that spends more on healthcare than any other nation in the world. 87 million people are either uninsured or underinsured. They pray not to get sick because they can't afford treatment. And we're the only of the wealthiest countries in the world that doesn't offer some form of universal health care. And every congressperson, when they get elected, and every senator get free health care paid for by the people. How is it that you can get elected by the people, and because you get elected, you get free health care and the best health care, but then you do not want the people who elected you to have the same thing? And you call doing it socialism rather than fulfilling the promises of the Constitution, equal protection under the law, the common, providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare of all people. When indigenous people on reservations today still face cruel decisions that trace all the way back to war treaties, and every number of poverty, every number of denial of healthcare has to be exponentially increased when we talk about the First Nation people of this world who were here first, we have a crisis of possibility. When 53 years after Episcopalians and Anglicans and Catholics and Baptists and Methodists and Muslims and others, Black and white and Latino, marched from the churches in Selma, were beaten on bridges, Black and white, some died to win the Voting Rights Act for all God's children. And 53 years later, we have less voting rights today than we had in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We have 400 bills in 49 states trying to pass bills that if they were passed, it would undermine the processes for access to the ballot that 56 million Americans, not just Black people, 56 million Americans utilized in 2020. And when a democracy has a whole group of people that want to run a political insurrection by denying the right to vote, we have a crisis of possibilities. When families in Flint, Michigan, like 4 million other families in America, can get up every morning and buy unleaded gas but they can't buy unleaded water for their children. We face a possibility of crisis. When the war economy, right now, we spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war and only 15% on education and healthcare. We face a crisis of possibility. Dr. King said there was a spiral toward death when military budgets and decisions have more weight than the decisions to lift people out of poverty. When we see this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism that doesn't follow the call of Jesus, the call of the prophets, that says, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? As a nation, when I was a stranger, did you welcome me? When I was undocumented, did you care for me? When I was in prison, did you address the realities of a prison industrial complex? My paraphrase. But instead, we see far too many religious heretics pacing a false gospel of division, a gospel that says, if you want to have a religious perspective in America, then you must be against gay people, against a woman's right to choose. You must believe in tax cuts for the wealthy. You must vote for a particular party. And you must suggest that Jesus was a founding member of the NRA and that the gun, in essence, is more important than the Bible. When we see this, we have a crisis of possibility when far too many people do not see that the Palestinian child is just as important as the Jewish child and the Black child and the Latino child and the Asian child. They do not understand that when our children are hungry, regardless of their race, they don't cry. They don't cry Black. They don't cry white. They cry hunger. They cry pain. When millions of people have been ignored in our common life, and it's not just the numbers, it's all of the people that live with the nightmares, we have a crisis of possibility because none of this has to be. I was thinking again about these workers we call service workers during COVID. They were not paid enough to build up savings, to tide them over in an emergency. Only 31% of Americans can afford a $1,000 emergency. They lack paid sick leave and medical leave and health insurance. Just the other day when the president went to meet with the G20, every nation there offered some form of paid family leave except America. Many of them lack access to unemployment insurance or affordable options. The people that work in food services, for instance, like waitresses, they couldn't even qualify for many of the benefits, the meager benefits of the COVID relief bill because they didn't make enough. There's not a county in this state, in this country right now, where working at $725, you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. We have a crisis of civilization. I think about Danielle, who has to work 70 hours a week, just to afford basic things. I think about the Black man that I met, and he told me I clean people's backsides in a medical facility that I can't even afford the health care to go to. I think about the ladies I met up in the hollows of the hills of West Virginia, low-wage workers needing $15 an hour, needing what Dr. King asked for, the March on Washington asked for in '63. Because in '63, one of the agenda items of the March on Washington was $2 an hour, which would be $15 today if it followed the rate of inflation. And these ladies from West Virginia told me, said, Reverend Barber and Bishop Barber, every Monday we sell tacos. I said, why you sell tacos? You enjoy doing it? They said, well, not really. But we sell it so we can make enough money to have a pool of money to give to each other to try to help the women with their needs during their menstrual cycles. Or I remember the Episcopal priest I met in Aberdeen, Washington, who's trying to minister to a town that has 16,000 human beings, but over 1,000 of them are homeless. The zip code with the largest number of homeless white millennials in Washington state, right there near all of the wealth of Microsoft and Amazon. We have crisis of possibility. When I think about in Kentucky, I remember going with the white clergy to stand with coal miners who have Black lung disease. And when we're going to the people in Harlan County, one of the 30 poorest counties in America, and I heard those folks say, nobody cares about us. Or going down in that geographical area of Selma, Alabama, and I remember Callie Greer, who told us how her daughter died right in her face because Alabama refused to expand healthcare. And so she died from something that could have been treated if she could have just gone to the hospital. Or I remember Pamela, who also died, whose children, both of them had to wear CPAP machines because of the mold in the trailer that predatory lenders tricked her into buying, and how it was so run down, and how she didn't even have running sewage in her house, but just a mile away or so, they ran the sewage to the dog pound. I think about the brothers and sisters living on the streets in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, or in Wisconsin when we were underneath the bridge or under the overpass with people there, and they said, Reverend, we won't be here long. We said, why? And they said, because the political convention is coming to town. I said, well, what does that have to do with it? They said, oh, they always move us. They do not let the conventioneers see us. Or in my own state, I've seen the kind of rejection that comes because of our broken immigration system. I met little Ezekiel, whose daddy was a pastor, had been in this country since 1985, but because he faced imminent deportation under the Trump administration, he had to leave home and live on the church grounds of a friend of mine for more than 4 years. And how he represents all over this country immigrants who have given so much and served so much and worked so much, and yet they're often treated as though they don't matter. And when I close my eyes sometimes, I see this crisis of possibility when I think about Vanessa and her dad, my brother, Dr. Winslow, of the Apache Nation in Arizona, who are fighting every day a multinational company that wants their land so bad to drill for a mineral that they just will get a little bit of it. 98% of what they drill for is unusual, but it will poison the aquifers. And they've been that company is supported by the politicians, but my Native American brothers and sisters simply have to fight. Or I think about Rosanelle Eaton, a 95-year-old woman that I stood with, who's dead now, who had to go to court with us. She was a lead on our case in 2013, and she was the lead plaintiff fighting voter suppression laws, because after the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance section, one of the senators and I said, now that the headache has been removed, we can do what we want to do. And they passed the worst voter suppression law we had seen since Jim Crow. And Rosanelle Eaton said, I got to come out and fight, even though she was one of the first Black women to register to vote and registered 5,000 people in her lifetime. At 95, she had to be a plaintiff to hold on to her vote and her right. Or I think about Amy, a poor white woman who's struggling to feed her kids up in Appalachia. And when the governor of the state expanded teacher salary, she's a teacher, by the way, with a master's degree, she didn't know that he also cut money from Medicare and cut food stamps to raise the teacher salary. And even with it raised, as a teacher with a master's degree, he can hardly survive. Or I think about Leon, a veteran I met in a homeless camp. He fought for his country. He has a flag planted on a tree branch outside of the tent and the car he sleeps in. And I asked him why. He says, Pastor, I want people to know what happens underneath the flag. I could run billion-dollar pieces of equipment in the military, but I've come home now and I can't even flip a hamburger. And this is happening right here in America. I'm being rejected. I could go on and on, but we have a crisis of possibility, far too much rejection. And the second thing that we have to understand is how we got here. We didn't just get here. The truth of the matter is what we're seeing, and a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the wanting to go backwards is a part of the iconography of a too often repeated reality in America, says Nell Painter, that famous scholar at Princeton. You know, when you think about what we're seeing now and all of the attacks and push against the poor and race, we can't forget in the 19th century following the Civil War, when Black and white, poor and low wealth people came together under the watchful eye of the military to change the South and change the country, provide public education for everybody. They were talking about healthcare then for everybody and wages protection, and they rewrote Constitution. But there were forces that hated this kind of democracy. And by 1870, 1871, 72, they started leading a violent backlash. 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed. 1877, a president gets elected without winning the popular vote. He loses the popular vote, but he gets the Electoral College from the South and guarantees the South that he'll pull out the troops and let the racists have their way and break up these fusion coalitions. And by 1883, the 1875 Civil Rights Act was overturned. By 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal was the law of the land. And by 1901, the last African-American congressperson that had been elected during Reconstruction was forced out of the Congress, and voting rights had been taken away, and black and white fusion coalitions had been undermined and destroyed. Don't get it twisted. What we see today, we've seen in part before. Think about the second Reconstruction. Sometimes we call it the Civil Rights Movement. During that time from 1954, the winning of the Brown case, and 54 is when Medicaid was created. Excuse me, not Medicaid, in the 60s Medicaid, but then in 54, Black people and people in the domestic culture and in the agrarian culture were finally allowed to pay into Social Security. Then we get the 64 Voting Civil Rights Act that actually helped white women as well. And then the 65 Voting Rights Act that helped all people when it comes to voting. And then, and it all came through blood and sweat and tears. But right in the middle of that, there was a pushback, a hatred of the unity of the civil rights movement, the hatred of the peace movement, the hatred of the women's movement. Dr. King was killed. And in the midst of that, a new strategy arose called the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy was developed by a guy by the name of Kevin Phillipson, Lee Atwater, and they told Richard Nixon that they knew how to win. They knew how to hold on to power forever. They knew how to pay off the wealthy, but they had to use something called positive polarization. They actually wrote a memo and said, you have to deliberately divide the country and use and treat people, get people to turn against one another and think that when women benefit and poor Black people and poor people of color benefit, that it's hurting them. And we have to split. They actually said we have to split the society, but we can't do it in graphic racial terms. We have to come up with new terms to use that are like racialized code language. So they came up with terms like entitlement and forced budgeting and tax cuts. And they seeded this plan. Richard Nixon used it. Others used it. Reagan used it to push his trickle down, his voodoo economics of trickle down. Bush used it. And being used today, Trumpism used it, but what Trumpism did was charismatized it and weaponized it, and financed it. But we didn't just get here. Remember, Coretta Scott King warned us about this violence years ago when somebody asked her about what she thought about violence since her husband was violently killed and murdered. And Coretta Scott King said, we must recognize the extent of violence in this society, and we better deal with it, because violence is not just a bullet taking my husband's life. Violence is denying people a living wage. Violence is denying people health care, denying people education. She said, violence is denying labor rights. And the violence, she went on to say, is denying people public education. And then she said, and there's another form of violence, and that is the apathy and the refusal to address the other forms of violence. And she said, we need to get in, because this violence is going to continue and get worse. But all of these attacks happen not because fusion coalitions and poor and low wealth people coming together were weak, but because they were strong. In 1965, the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, Dr. King said the great fear of the greedy aristocracy of this nation was for poor and low wealth white people and Black people to come together and form a political power structure that could reshape the economic architecture of the nation. And so we need to know this. And in this moment, we've got to decide. I believe in this crisis a possibility that we need a third Reconstruction, The first two were destroyed and violently uprooted, but we need a third reconstruction, and there's no time to waste. It's democracy versus autocracy. It's the battle of our time. We must escalate the nonviolent moral struggle for a third reconstruction. What would a third reconstruction look like? First, it would be updating our poverty measures so that we properly tell the truth about poverty and low income. It would be expanding democratic participation and protecting the right to vote. It would be protecting the constitutional rights of assembly and free speech that are coming under attack now. What would a third reconstruction look like? It would be ensuring that the legislation that improves the conditions of 140 million people were passed, and that we did all legislation from the bottom up, including the expanded protections for frontline essential workers and guaranteed incomes and expansions of unemployment insurance and resources for childcare. Do you know the $2 trillion that poor and low that the billionaires made in the last 19 months could fund most of these things for more than 10 years? That's what we should be talking about. If we have an earned income tax credit and child tax credit and expand healthcare, how much does it cost not to do these things? But if we do, how much would it benefit? If we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, 32 million Americans would come out of poverty and low wealth, 40% of Black people, and it would also pump $330 billion into the economy. A moral agenda is also an economically sound agenda. And to not address the issues of poverty and low wealth is constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible. It is politically incompetent and economically insane, particularly since poor and low wealth people represent 30% of the electorate now. We need a third reconstruction. We need to raise the minimum wage, living wage, and we ensure that workers, wherever they are, can join unions. A third reconstruction. We have to enact fair taxes on corporations. We got to stop giving the corporations socialism that's for the wealthy and the greedy. They need to pay their fair share. We need to repeal the 2017 tax cuts. We need to institute a wealth tax. We need to make sure that we properly tax investment income. We need to use the power of deficit spending, as we've done in other ways, to invest, because it'll come back to us. Right now, we don't have inflation because people have too much money. We have inflation because we've been through, going through COVID, and the production hasn't caught up with the demand yet. But the fact of the matter is people need resources and investment in those resources, and we can pay for everything with just a fair tax on the billionaires. It's time to go to work. It's time for third reconstruction. We've got to guarantee quality health care for all. We have to guarantee safe and quality housing for all. We must guarantee the right for water, the right to water, and ending water and utility shutoffs and making water clean. And do you know that in the United Nations, this was voted on in 1948 after World War II as human rights. And America agreed to it then. We must implement a federal jobs program to ensure good jobs and increase public investment in infrastructure. But we have to have infrastructure that reaches to the poorest communities. The infrastructure package we just passed, only $550 billion of it is new money. And the way it's coming to the states, there are no riders on it that say the states have to spend it in the communities that need it most. We need guaranteed quality, safe, equitable public education and accessible education infrastructure from pre-K to 12. Yes, we need free pre-K. Yes, what is wrong with us? Yes, you want to know how healthy a society is? The African proverb says, take a look at the children. Yes, we must enact relief from student debt and medical debt and housing debt, utilities debt. Yes, we must have an comprehensive and just immigration reform. We are a nation of immigrants. Our brothers and sisters, for instance, from Mexico, they didn't cross the border. We crossed the border. Texas used to be Mexico. Arizona, New Mexico, California were Mexico. Our Haitian brothers and sisters, let's remember the history. When the Haitians ran the French out of there after the French colonized them for years, it was America and other Western cultures that made the Haitians have to pay their colonizers back. They had to pay the folk that came in and took their resources. That's why the country's never been able to fully flourish. Sure, we must end these child detentions and family separation. Sure, we must ensure all the rights of indigenous people and tribal nations, including the right for the free expression of their religion. Sure, we must have a third Reconstruction. We must embrace a bold agenda, according to the Economic Policy Institute, to transform the economy away from a climate chaos to a green, renewable energy economy that prioritizes the poor and low-income frontline communities and builds up publicly owned, not privately owned, publicly owned and controlled green energy infrastructure. Yes, we must do a third Reconstruction. We must demilitarize our U.S. foreign policy. We cannot continue to spend over 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy, when one military contract could fund every state that has denied Medicaid expansion. That's going in the wrong direction. Yes, we need infrastructure. We need jobs. We need to deal with our roads and our bridges and our technology, but we need to protect the infrastructure of our democracy, which is voting right, the infrastructure of our daily lives, education and healthcare, and other things. And we need the infrastructure of our bus for our roads and our bridges and our technology, and we can do it all. And it hardly costs anything. Do you realize that even in this infrastructure bill that was just passed, is less than 1% of the total output of the American economy, over $21 trillion a year? Yes, we must end unjust mass incarceration and violent policing. And it's time for more than emails and text. We've got to move nonviolently. We've got to move together. We've got to come together and see all of these things as connected. And yes, some of it's in the street because we have to. We must come together. We must challenge the politics of greed and money. We must do it, and we must have a group of people, a remnant of people who will go with poor and low-wealth people, not for them, and other advocates and moral leaders. You know, I'm a preacher, and in the Bible, in Amos chapter 5, it literally says, God says, if I can find a remnant who will cry and wail in the streets and act like things are wrong, God says, then I will assist you and help you. And then justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And understand, that's how it's always happened. When the rejected folk like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and some white Quakers and white evangelicals got together, they formed a fusion movement in the 1800s, and they brought about abolition. When women were rejected and didn't have the right to vote, Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and others got together and they fought until women won the right to vote. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had won the victory, that separate but equal was the law of the land, and it was for a while. But then Thurgood Marshall, a rejected lawyer who almost didn't make it out of law school, got together with white lawyers and black lawyers and Jewish lawyers and Christian lawyers. And they used the dissent of Justice Harlan from Harlan, Kentucky, when he dissented on Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And they used his dissent to build case law, and they won. It looked like Jim Crow had beaten down justice and couldn't rise anymore. But then Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and a Jewish rabbi named Heschel and Bayard Rustin, a brother who was rejected because he was gay, and James Reeb, a white man, and Viola Woosa, a white woman. They got together, they stood together against Jim Crow, and they tore it down in apartheid in South Africa. It looked invincible, but then when Nelson Mandela, who had been rejected, got together with Bishop Tutu and Peter Story of the White Methodists and the mothers of South Africa and the young people of South Africa and other people around the world, we tore apartheid down. That's what has to happen today. We must have a coming together in this country of people who say we do not have to accept the levels of racism and poverty and ecological devastation, denial of healthcare, and the war economy. We don't have to accept 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth in the richest nation in the world. And if we come together as poor and low wealth and advocates and religious and moral leaders, we can challenge this country. We can redeem it from its own self-destruction. We can bring forth a moral revival. But it's going to take the kind of the people, a remnant of the rejected, to do it. There not only has to be, if you will, a sociological and political, geographical shift, if you will. In other words, things have to change on the landscape of our politics, the landscape of our communities, the landscape of of the way in which we come together. And it can happen. It can happen. Because when we all get together, when all of us who love justice and love truth and love lifting people and love mercy get together, we can shift things. It's happened before, can happen again. And if you are moved tonight by these stats, if you believe we need a third Reconstruction, if you believe it doesn't have to be like this, then I want you geographically to be in Washington, D.C. on June 18, 2022, with your brothers and sisters in the human family, where poor and low-wealth people will be front and center. They will be speaking, they will be demanding, they will be laying out their pain and possibility. It will be not a day, but a declaration that not on our watch can we accept this. This land is your land, this land is my land. And we have to shift what is going on. God forbid that history would write that we lived in this particular geographical portion of this world. And we lived here. And we didn't change here. And we left here the same way we found things here. Oh no, we don't want that to be the conclusion of the matter when it comes to our short existence in this world. Everything we here need to change the realities that exist is already is available, because it's you, it's me, it's us. All we need to do is bring it together. Somebody says, well, Reverend Barber, I'm not always sure you're going to win. Well, I know one thing, you're not going to win a thing if you don't fight. They say, well, Reverend Barber, it's going to take a long time. Well, you haven't seen long, because some people fought slavery for 250 years. Women didn't get the right to vote from the time this country was founded, 1776, all the way to 1920. Let's stop talking about being tired. Let's start talking about being true to our deepest moral values, and recognize that we do not have a scarcity of resources. We do not have a scarcity of ideas, social ideas. We have a scarcity of moral consciousness. And it's going to take a moral conscious movement of all people to shift that narrative, to build power, and to change what is into what ought to be. I want to be a part of that number. I hope you do as well. Thank you for allowing me to be with you. And by the way, as I close, everywhere I go, I've been telling people, you know, during COVID, one day as people were dying, I had one family in my church had 12 people to die in one family. Another member in the Poor People's Campaign had 32 people to die, I believe, in one family. So one day I was sitting around thinking, and it just dawned on me, I said, Lord, why is it that I didn't get COVID? I know I've been around it. I had to be around many people. Why is it? And I kept asking that question in a moment of deep meditation, and because I know I'm not better than anybody that had COVID and died. I know I'm not, greater than anybody. I know it. And teachers, you know it. All of these these teachers of geography, you know wherever you are in this country, people who died, people who didn't die, is not because they were worse off than us. And in the middle of that thinking where I was, it dawned on me in the spirit, wrong question. The question is not why didn't I get COVID, but what am I going to do with the reality of still being here? Because the truth of the matter is, all of us are about 6 minutes away from death. If anybody that's listening to me, if your breath shuts down for 6 minutes and you can't breathe any longer, most people are going to be brain trouble. You're going to die. That's it. 6 minutes, 6 minutes, 6 minutes. And it dawned on me that the question is not, why wasn't my 6 minutes taken from me? But what am I going to do with the 6 minutes, 6 hours, 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, 60 days, 60 years that I may have left. And in that moment, it dawned on me that breath is too important. Breath is too valuable to waste it on lying and cheating and being unjust and being apathetic and not caring for the least of these. And the only thing we should be using our breath for is to breathe freedom, breathe justice, breathe equality, breathe truth, breathe love more and more into the reality of our society. That's the only thing we ought to be using our breath for, because anything else is a waste of time. And so while you still have breath in your body, let us all come together and make it so that when it's all said and done, somebody might be able to say, because our generation lived, because we didn't accept these realities that didn't have to be, somebody right here in these geographical locations, as my granddaddy used to say, down here on this green terrestrial ball, will be able to say my life was I was able to breathe a little easier. My load was a little lighter. My life was a little better because that generation lived and chose to breathe justice, truth, fairness, and equality into America. God bless you.